Welcome back to Bench Build. This video covers the scratch or base plaster after the plastic and lath has gone on. The materials you will need are cement, sand, and water, and these are the tools you will need for the day.
We have the sand already ready to go. We put the sand in the wheelbarrow first because it doesn't stick to the wheelbarrow as bad as the cement does. So this is our cement. I grabbed the one that said type S. The other one is also good for mortar, the type 2 I believe it was. It just said to add lime. Honestly, with or without lime, it will work. So now we had a bucket and a half of the sand. We're just going to do a half a bucket of cement. Make sure you wear a mask because if it goes in your lungs, it will stay there. And again, just like the mud, we're going to pre-mix it. Otherwise, you just end up with chunks of cement. The reason we mix our own mortar is it's cheaper than buying it pre-mixed and in bags. Also, if you're working with a community, it's a great education because understanding the difference between mortar and concrete when you're actually hand mixing those things. This is all mixed up so you can see there's no different colors, there's no chunks of sand, there's a few chunks of cement. Try to break those up. May not want to use your hands. One thing that does work, if you do get mortar on your hands or cement, vinegar, I did forget it today, but even if you get wet cement and whatnot on you, at the end of the day, rinse off with some vinegar and it'll counteract it. And it is time to add the water. Same as with the mud. Don't add too much. You can always add more. So, again, I like to pull it away from the end. Make sure there's no dry stuff stuck in the corners up where it likes to hang out. And then slowly pull it all back. Keep your mask on until all of it is wet, so you don't inhale any of that cement. Now you just pretty much work back and forth. If you need to add some water, do. But I like to wait until I don't have any more pockets of water along the sides and corners. You're gonna want the consistency a little thicker than pancake batter. Almost there. We are ready to plaster now. And the first thing I'm going to do with my leather gloves on is I'm going to just make sure there's not too much loose junk, debris anywhere around the tire on the grass. And I'm going to switch my gloves out. Love these gloves. A lot of guys who do concrete work all the time, they wear concrete gloves, which have the vinyl front, but the back is open. We do a lot of work by hand. These cover better, which is why I prefer them. We will be using a trowel. This is the preferred trowel for me because it's rounded, so it's not making sharp cuts into your thing. It's flexible, so it's often called a pull trowel, and it's easier for smoothing on. But again, we do a lot by hand because it's just easier sometimes. So we're gonna start on the top. Pick the mortar up with the back of the trowel is usually the easiest. And it is puffy on top, and that's okay. You cannot nail the lath down on the top. The plaster will eventually weigh it down and fill in the gap. So the top is the first part we do. It needs to be thicker on the top because it is filling in that gap, but you don't want it too thick. This is just the first coat, so you will see the texture of the lath through the plastic. The top is looking pretty good, so now I'm going to use our scratch trowel. You could potentially use like a tile trowel that makes the grout lines for thin set. I prefer this because it's softer and you don't end up taking off material with it. I suggest doing this as you go because things can dry quicker than you realize. Chunks all over it. Quick, I just want to show this is where we're at on the top. Have the scratches, you can see a little bit of the lath, and that's okay. And we're gonna start doing the sides. I forgot to bring some today, but it can be super useful to have a piece of cardboard or even some scrap plastic, something to put underneath here to catch the extra mortar. Definitely decreases the amount of weight you will have at the end of the day. On the side, because I'm using less plaster, I load the top of the trowel so it goes straight onto the bench. Starting at the bottom and just working your way up. For the curved part, you gotta be careful because there's sharp metal, and if you pull against it, it'll rip your glove and your hand. So you can't put it on with, honestly, way easier to do curves this way. Just be extremely careful not to rip your hand open. Then I'll come back and I'm pushing it in with the trowel again so I don't bleed. Again, you're going to drop some on the ground. I cut it away. If it's a lot and you can take the top portion of it, you can still use it. If there's dirt on it, don't. Try to keep it pulled away as you go. The trowel edge is super helpful with that. This area is about good for the day. Probably add a little bit more there. A little bit more right here because there is, well, actually there's sharp parts, and part of, for me, this step is making it not hazardous. I really don't like to leave a bench with just lath for very long because it is just too dangerous. We're also getting some popping up. This is popping up, so I'll go ahead and add some more. It'll make it a little bit thicker, but this is again our first coat, so I don't mind making this a little thicker just to make sure this gets filled in, because if this first coat cracks, it is better than our second coat cracking. Going to go ahead and scratch this again. If I need to come back and add more, fix it, whatever, I can do that, but I can't scratch it once it's dry, and if it's too smooth, the next coat will not stick. So that's a bad thing. wheelbarrow, it will dry out much more quickly. So the thicker of a and this is our first scratch coat complete. So every side is covered and scratched. Again, if it's smooth, like even this, I will probably scratch this up just a little bit by hand right there. Also making sure these bottom edges are cleaned out. If the concrete sticks or the mortar sticks, getting off later requires chipping, which usually costs you some on the bench as well, creating a hole and a problem and a loss of time. Again, here's a little bug and a little smooth part, just hand cleaning it up. So that was one toadstool. That was a pretty large tire. That was a, same as this one. So it was a 265 R18. That's what tire we just did. And that's how much mortar we have left. So don't usually just do one toadstool. So we have a bunch left. So that was a bucket and a half to half a bucket of cement, bucket and a half of sand to half a bucket of cement, and that is how much we have left doing one toadstool. And that is the scratch plaster, which is thicker, or the first coat of scratch plaster, which is thicker than the second coat. So that would have easily done one more half toadstool, and maybe, and if not a little bit more.